Okay people, this time around I've been asked to do some horror film double features, so right after this intro we will get into some classic horror movie double features for you to enjoy.
Hammer time!
I love Hammer horror movies. In 2004 when we went to London, the biggest thrill of me wasn't seeing the lines of Trafalgar Square or seeing Buckingham Palace or 221B Baker Street. It was accidentally finding Hammer House in Wardour Street. We movie buffs are like that, we're weird. Between the 1940s and the mid-1970s, Hammer Productions made quality big pictures for the British, American and Australian market. It took them until the late 1950s to realise that what the punters really wanted was gory horror films with lots of blood. There are so many cool Hammer horror films to pick for a classic double feature, but I have narrowed it down to two. Based on Nigel Kneale's BBC TV series, the Quatermass Experiment was Hammer's first big horror hit. 3 astronauts go into space in a British-American rocket. The rocket crashes into a paddock and the investigators find one man inside, Victor Carroon, played by Richard Wordsworth. Professor Bernard Quatermass, played by American import Brian Donlevy, investigates what happened to the other 2 astronauts and why Carroon seems to have a disease that is mutating him. Richard Wordsworth is the hero of this one as far as the acting is concerned. Without really saying a word, he is terrific as the ill-fated astronaut. Brian Donlevy isn't as good as a shouty, bossy Quatermass.
Can't you do something to increase the metabolic rate? I never knew pressure effects to last this long.
But the worst acting award goes to Margia Dean playing Carroon's wife.
Is he any better?
He's coming along fine.
If only he'd say something. Give us a sign that he's thinking, that he knows we're here.
She was another American import, and her career was sort of enhanced by the fact that she had a relationship with Spiros Skouras, president of 20th Century Fox at the time. Her acting in the Quatermass Experiment is fascinatingly awful.
What will the name be?
Carroon. Victor Carroon.
Oh.
He's all right, isn't he?
In the movie, the threat escalates as Carroon escapes from hospital and continues to mutate into something that becomes an existential threat to the human race. The movie was filmed in glorious black and white on a budget of only £42,000, and this is one of those movies that shows you can tell a good story on a relatively low budget, even if 2 of your actors are kind of piss weak. The other half of this double feature goes to Horror of Dracula, also known as Dracula in some markets, Hammer's 1958 magnum opus, starring Peter Cushing as an earnest and athletic Van Helsing, going up against Christopher Lee's iconic, imposing Count Dracula. For me, Lee's vampire is much better than Bela Lugosi's one for many reasons, the best of which is that he's simply scary as hell. Going back to Bram Stoker's original book rather than the stage adaptation that was used for the 1931 Lugosi version was a really good idea. The story and the number of characters are simplified from the original text, but that doesn't really affect it in a bad way. For instance, the de-aging of Count Dracula as Harker stays in Castle Dracula is not a part of this story, which is a good thing. It always seemed to me a distraction from the main narrative. You can check the sequels out as well, some of which have Christopher Lee in it, others don't. There was The Brides of Dracula in 1960, Dracula Prince of Darkness in 66, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave in 68, Taste the Blood of Dracula in 1970, Scars of Dracula 1971, Dracula AD 1972, and Satanic Rites of Dracula in 1973. There's also The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, which was Hammer's kung fu vampire movie, but it barely has anything like Dracula in it at all. Amicus Studios, run by an American expatriate called Milton Subotsky, was the Pepsi to Hammer's Coca-Cola, the other studio that did similar movies. In the 60s and 70s, it put out a lot of horror films, most of them not quite as good as the Hammer equivalent. Back in those days, people were hungry for content, and Amicus supplied it. The people at Amicus loved anthology horror films, the movies with a frame story and 4 to 6 smaller stories told within that linking narrative. The idea came from the 1946 British film Dead of Night, which kick-started the subgenre, which continues to this day in films like VHS and A Field Guide to Evil. For the double feature, I'm going with one of the more obscure Amicus anthology films, The Vault of Horror from 1973. 5 men step into an elevator in a London apartment building and find themselves in a sub-basement room that looks like a supper club. Each of them then recounts a horrible dream that they had. This is the silliest of the Hammer anthologies, but I like it for a few reasons. The 5 characters in question are played by Daniel Massey, Kurt Jurgens, Michael Craig, Terry Thomas, and Tom Baker a year before he snookered his career by becoming Doctor Who. We get a grab bag of monsters in this one. We get vampires, we get a wife driven insane by her husband's smug obsessive-compulsive disorder, a really badly thought-out insurance scam, a stolen magical device, and an artist gifted with a dangerous kind of voodoo. All of these stories telegraph their endings to some extent, but they give us a fun ride getting there. Interestingly, Glynis Johns plays the housewife driven nuts by Terry Thomas's obsessive-compulsive husband. Her father, Mervyn Johns, was the main character in Dead of Night back in 1946. The second Amicus movie I'm going to talk about is a hidden gem. Based on an obscure novel by Peter Saxon, Scream and Scream Again really delivers the goods. Directed by Gordon Hessler, it's a weirdly disjointed movie with several different plot lines that eventually sort of come together. An athlete passes out while on a run and wakes up in a very unusual hospital. An intelligence officer returns from overseas to an Eastern European dictatorship and kills his boss with a reversed Vulcan neck pinch. And in London, police detectives track down a serial killer who drains women of blood. The plot all makes sense in the end, kind of, but the centerpiece of this movie is a really bravura 15-minute chase through London where the cops try to apprehend the serial killer, who seems to have supernatural abilities. The cinematography, direction, stunt work and editing here are next level for this kind of movie. Add to this the fact that you get Vincent Price, Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing in the same film, and you've got yourself a winner. In the 1930s and 1940s, nobody made horror movies like Universal Studios. They were the MCU of scaring the shit out of people during the Depression. What scared people then is, of course, very different to what scares people now. In those days, they were scared by the living dead, being homeless and eating in a soup kitchen while you coughed up a lung with tuberculosis. Now people are scared of Blumhouse movies, not being able to get Botox during the lockdown, and the spine-tingling fear of running out of toilet paper. Times change. We all wouldn't know about Dracula, Frankenstein, the Invisible Man, the Mummy, or the Wolfman without Universal. So I did pick 2 of the films. I went with the best, the 2 films directed by a very interesting man called James Whale. This is a movie that made a jobbing actor called William Pratt into Boris Karloff. His creature is the first sympathetic monster of the sound era of cinema, and for 40 years after this movie, Karloff went on to entertain and frighten moviegoers.
They had a new dance, and it went like this. Papa Papa Doo Ba. The name of the dance is the Peppermint Twist. Papa Papa Doo Ba. You like it like this, the Peppermint Twist. Papa Papa Doo Ba. Add to Karloff Kenneth Strickfaden's brilliant flashing and crackling electrical equipment, which used at least one real Tesla coil. And Jack Pierce's iconic makeup, and James Whale's genius direction. It was only the 3rd film he made, by the way. And you have, wait for it, lightning in a bottle. Nothing Lugosi did in Dracula can compare to this one. It moved the genre forward, giving it a momentum that it continues to this day. This movie starts out really interestingly with Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley and Lord Byron in the Villa Diodati during that gloomy summer in 1816, where Mary wrote Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus. Mary's played by Elsa Lanchester, who also played the titular bride. We then move on to Ernest Thessinger's outrageously flamboyant Dr. Pretorius, who seduces Henry Frankenstein, played by Colin Clive, into working with him to create more life. You don't even have to go past Pretorius's toast.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
And him revealing he's a monkey-lite of Frankenstein to know that this one's a winner.
My first experiment was so lovely that we made her a queen.
That's before you get to the monster wanting a female companion and the creation of the bride and her shrieking rejection of the monster. This was the first truly campy horror movie, and there's so much to love in it. Universal as a horror studio had a renaissance in the 1950s with the advent of drive-in theatres and the commensurate need for entertainment to cater to younger adults and teenagers. By the middle of the decade, budget units from other studios like Columbia and Paramount were pumping out westerns, war films and horror movies. Universal started the 50s making scary genre films like Abbott and Costello Go to Mars. But as the decade progressed, they began to make interesting science fiction / horror films. The best of these were directed by this guy, a science fiction fan himself called Jack Arnold. So I had to go for a Jack Arnold double feature. Tarantula came 2 years into the 1950s resurgence of the giant monster film, which started in the 1920s with The Lost World and continued in the 1930s with King Kong. The plot of this one is fairly simple but satisfyingly dynamic. A severely mutated man dies in the Arizona desert, and Dr. Matt Hastings, played by generic leading man John Agar, diagnoses him with acromegaly, a hormonal abnormality that takes years to develop. And yet for this guy, it manifested in days. The dead man was a scientist working with Dr. Gerald Deemer, played by Leo G. Carroll, who was experimenting with hormones and radioactivity to increase the size of food animals, or at least that's what he says he's doing. For some reason during his experiments, he creates a Labrador-sized tarantula, which escapes and keeps growing, eating livestock and farmers until it's the size of Uluru. Eventually the Air Force have to send Clint Eastwood to napalm it, and yes, that is Clint Eastwood playing the fighter pilot. The real tarantula used on miniature sets and placed against rear projection backdrops works surprisingly well for the monster, and it holds the movie in good stead when you're watching it with a modern audience. The Incredible Shrinking Man, based on the novel by Richard Matheson, is a high-concept body horror science fiction movie. Scott Carey, played by Grant Williams, is on a boat that drifts through a radioactive cloud. Soon after, he finds himself shrinking. His wife Louise, played by Randy Stewart, is sympathetic, but as time progresses, the relationship starts to break down. Scott becomes a national curiosity and flees the media scrutiny, and eventually he shrinks down to become so tiny that the house in which he was once the master becomes an existential threat to him. This movie does some really interesting things with the idea of masculinity and the role of the man in a household. The use of oversized sets and props, as well as reprojection effects, sticks the landing with this ambitious and iconic movie. It's one of the great science fiction films of the 1950s. Saul Bass was a filmmaker and title designer who created the titles for many iconic movies like Vertigo, North by Northwest, Spartacus, Walk on the Wild Side, and It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. He made one feature film as a director, and it's a visionary piece of science fiction horror called Phase 4. After a mysterious cosmic event, ants in the deserts of Arizona develop a sophisticated group mind and begin to build strange towers. A team of scientists led by Nigel Davenport's Dr. Ernest Hubbs and Michael Murphy's James Lesko study the ants. As the sophistication of the ant civilization increases, the scientists decide to destroy the colony and kill the queen ant. It does not go the way they planned. Bass gave us a movie that's visually sophisticated and pushes the limits of 1970s film technology to tell a unique, intelligent science fiction horror story. Phase 4 really never got enough love in the genre, where flashier and shallower films tend to be praised. But this one's the real deal. It's worth tracking down and watching it with close attention. This pseudo-documentary doesn't fit into an easy category. Actor Lawrence Pressman plays a scientist called Nils Hellstrom, who is convinced that the insect world poses a threat to the human race, and that eventually insects will rule the earth.
My name is Nils Hellstrom. If that name rings a bell at all, it's probably in connection with the words fanatic, lunatic, heretic. Actually, I'm a scientist. And these other descriptions have come as a result of my dedication and my work.
Using documentary footage, clips from science fiction movie, and Hellstrom's face-to-the-camera narration,
It explores the sophistication of insect biology and makes its argument that the individualization that is a human speciality is going to prove to be a weakness in what Hellstrom perceives to be the battle between us and the insects. Like Phase 4, this is high concept stuff, and Pressman as Hellstrom gives us a paranoid, edgy protagonist who may just be right. You all know what steampunk is, right? Fiction that shows a retro-futuristic or anachronistic steam-powered technology or society, like the giant spider in the Wild Wild West, the Nautilus in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and the British monarchy. The term steampunk was coined in 1986 by this guy, American writer K.W. Jeter, who was trying to find a name for the genre of fiction that writers like himself, Tim Powers and James Blaylock were producing. In cinema there was steampunk before steampunk was a thing. George Powell's ambitious 1960 version of H.G. Wells' 1895 novel is, at its heart, a horror movie. The cannibalistic Morlocks and the 1960s nuclear war, and the tragedy that George the Time Traveller, played brilliantly by Rod Taylor, finds when he's moved through time to the year 802,701. This movie is so rich with detail and humanity. There's George's bromance with his friend Philby, played by Alan Young, his idealism and his naive conceit that there's a better world in the future. There's the skepticism of his friends, the loss of knowledge in the future library. This is a beautiful and horrifying film, and it looks at the big picture of what it is to be human. The 2004 remake, starring another Australian actor, Guy Pearce, doesn't work so well in spite of the incredibly advanced special effects. There are the double features. If you want more, pick a genre and let me know. Thank you for watching to the end. You rock. You probably already liked this video and subscribed to the channel and hit the notification bell because you're that cool. I'll catch you next week with more recommendations. Take care, stay safe, and watch some movies.